Well, this actually it's really interesting because a lot of what I've been kind of struggling with the work that I do with some of the transport unions has a lot of connections with what Marissa's just been talking about. I've been doing work with international trade union federations in the transport sector for over 25 years. And one of the interesting things in the UK is that we now have the impact agenda, which is part of, so we're supposed to show how our work has impact on the kind of social actors. So we try and kind of build this into the research that we do. And my first chance of doing this was with this project with road transport workers. So although I've been involved in doing this work before with others, this was the kind of like the first attempt to try and be a bit more systematic about how you actually go about trying to make change through the work that we do. So what I've been doing is thinking about the, as an academic working with trade union and the kind of things that we can contribute to these, trying to get them to think about who the different stakeholders are in the work that they do, and then also thinking about how best to approach the EU institutions, because most of this work is related on the transport sector, on road transport, that I'll say in a moment. So thinking about how we approach the Commission by doing good research, because people in the Commission read stuff. Okay, so I hope they read stuff, but they very quickly dismiss bad research. So you have to do good research. That's the kind of first thing with them. With the European Council, because it's a Council of Ministers, the route there is through your national Minister of Transport. So we go through conventional kind of political lobbying at the national level. So the question then is how the European organisation gets all the national unions to kind of campaign in a particular way over a European issue and show how that will impact on the national market in their particular country. The European Parliament is then quite different, because these people represent, they have a European mandate, but they're also a national mandate as well. So you can lobby them kind of locally around local issues in their particular country, but also at a European level, because you have very different political alliances between different groups in at the European level. And it's possible to engage in the kind of conventional political lobbying action, but also some unconventional kind of actions and activities as well. So the work that we've had 2 projects with the European Transport Workers Federation on road transport. One looking at the whole issue of pricing in road transport and how that impacts on business models and competition in that particular sector. And then the other has been specifically about driving time, working conditions and well-being for bus and coach drivers. So what we try to do here is get people to think about how proposed changes to the way in which the market operates will impact on drivers. And building on some of the things that we talked about this morning, our approach to this is to say, well, what would the worst operator do? What's the worst you could do with changes to regulations? So currently, if you look at road haulage, if you cross an international border, so you'll see the blue bus goes into one country and then out, you can do 3 domestic trips within that country within 7 days. What's being proposed is you can do any number of operations over 5 days, as long as you then cross the border. Now, if you think then about how logistics and all the computer stuff operates now, you can basically become a domestic operator in another country. If you get unlimited number of internal trips, you just cross the border and come back again. So if you work out the worst case scenario of how this will operate, you can show a working pattern for drivers, which will break working time regulations and all kinds of other counter social conditions, which is what we've tried to do over on this particular model. What we also know is that most drivers in Europe who are now employed by, a lot of them employed through letterbox companies, a lot of them from Eastern Europe, basically live, sleep, eat in their trucks for months on end. And what's being proposed, I mentioned this morning, is this idea that you get a paid trip back home after a certain period of time, etc. But it's unlikely to change this kind of practice. If you're imprisoned in Europe, you have a right as a citizen for, I think it's 6 square metres of cell space. Most of these trucks are less than 2 square metres. And so you're living in these. And some of the new designs are actually taking more space out for things like car transporters and things like that. So people are living in these and working in these confined spaces. The project that we've had on, so this project is very much about kind of working conditions, and there have been particular campaigns related to particular companies. So we had a campaign against IKEA. If you look at IKEA's website, they have fantastic corporate social responsibility programs, all these kind of things, to do some very nice things. They contract with a road haulage company that then subcontracts. And so because they can't control that relationship, there are all these workers doing this kind of thing, which is very bad publicity. So a lot of our activities there have been related to these working conditions and these just inhumane conditions for these particular drivers. With bus and coach drivers, we've been much more focused on issues around health and safety. Here's Flixbus again. You can just see it's just got the little logo on the side there, because this is a crash that took place in a tunnel in Paris. This was a bus going from Paris to London. Nobody died on this particular trip, but you can imagine people are a bit shaken by that. So the Commission's argument, when you look at this, the Commission will say things like, well, yeah, there are these abuses of the rules, but so they acknowledge that these practices take place, but their solution to this is better enforcement. So they say, better enforcement of these systems. So there's nothing wrong in principle with these things. It's just regulating behaviour in the market. So having an open market is a good idea. It's just how we regulate the behaviour of these people. So as far as they're concerned, there's no requirement for any particular labour market policies to address any potential erosion of standards. Our argument is the opposite. And so what we've tried to do is demonstrate that enforcement mechanisms are ineffective. And if you're in the session here, in this room, the previous session, there was a discussion there about inspection services. And it's exactly the same story here. Inspection agencies with less resources, more pressure on them. We don't have a European enforcement agency for road transport in the way that we do for civil aviation, for example. So why do we have it? More people are killed on the road than die in aviation crashes, but why don't we have an enforcement agency, a European enforcement agency, at this particular, for road transport? So again, you can see where we're coming from with this, with trying to emphasise the stakeholders and the role of enforcement agencies and the problems that they have enforcing the rules. And again, if you look at the data from inspections, not only do you find that there are a lot of cases of kind of violation of the rules and the regulations. What's also really interesting, the figures in red are the figures for when the inspection agencies focused on a particular issue. And what you'll see here is that it's only when they go looking for driver's hours, for example, that you find it. So in the normal run of the things, these inspectors don't have the skills. Again, this point was raised earlier in the previous session, that when these people don't have the expertise to do these really technical things, they don't look for it. So all these things slip under the radar, and it's only when they're particularly targeted in particular weeks do they actually find it. So there's no significant difference between other types of violations in a target week as opposed to a regular week. The only one that's statistically significantly different is the driver's hours. So again, it's about trying to convince the Commission with good academic research, this idea that you give them robust results rather than showing pictures of buses that have crashed and things like this. So rather than the kind of emotional appeal, we're trying to do the kind of the cold hard facts. Do you remember facts? We used to have those, didn't we, in days gone by? So sorry, I'll skip over that. What we also did as well, we did a survey of nearly 600 bus and coach drivers from a number of different countries to look at their working time and their conditions. And here we focused on the pressure on the drivers to perform their job and therefore their compliance with the working time regulations. So you find that they're doing a lot of things that they're not being paid for. So there's the process of work intensification for these people. And a lot of that is related to, as I said before, in the case of Flixbus, they focus on utilisation of the bus, maximising revenue. So they're asking drivers to do it, rather than employ somebody to clean the bus, they get the driver to do it. rather than, they get drivers doing additional work, trying to sell drinks and things on board the bus. They make them responsible for loading and unloading the bus. So these are all kind of activities, extra work that's put on drivers. And we find in particular that drivers' working time is extended through preparation time and travel to and from work. Now, in the first presentation about was it? I can't remember. Sorry, I'm losing which presentation. But it's quite interesting. In France, is the only country where they actually count and actually pay for preparation time for drivers. So if you look at the driving time of road haulage drivers, for example, in France, it's much less than in other countries. So there's pressure at the national level there to utilise the drivers more effectively. Well, that's because they're complying with the law. So there's this is the way in which this kind of competition works through the system. So we know that these drivers are doing lots of extra work that they're not being paid for, and that their rest times and their recovery times are being compromised by all this additional work and not having sufficient rest periods. And we know scientifically, because we can link that to the medical evidence, that this then is a threat to road safety. So again, we see what people are doing during their rest times. They're doing all this additional work, loading, parking, cleaning the bus, etc. So our conclusion from this kind of process, or my conclusion on trying to get these, trying to, as an academic, trying to work with these organisations to get involved in these campaigns. I mean, the first thing is coach drivers, truck drivers are not dockers. One of the things that is very effective when we said about unconventional action with the European Parliament, the guys here, when key policies were being debated in Strasbourg at the Parliament, thousands of dock workers turned up in the dock workers campaign, threw gas canisters, and you can see these guys are kitted out. They're ready for a riot. They're not turning up in jeans and a t-shirt. They're turning up with gas masks on because they know that they're there for a fight. And so these it's this thing about struggle and the fact that you're prepared to fight for these things. Drivers are less well organised, they're very fragmented. So the idea of having an industrial campaign, an industrial action to back up some of this action. So we've had a few demos and nice polite marches and things like that, but nothing with the other groups. It's clear that unions need to combine national and international political action. It's also pretty clear that a lot of these publicity campaigns that are targeted at the general public are fairly short-lived. That it hits the press and then it just kind of fades away. And then a few months later, when you ask if the company's changed the contractor or anything else, very little has happened. And what's been much more effective for us are trying to mobilise around campaigns around things like public service obligations for transport, and actually getting people involved then in this idea of how the regulations matter and how it will affect communities. And I think the kind of conclusion that we've come to with the Commission is that they're not actually interested in evidence-based policy making. They're interested in policy-based evidence making. And if you look at, for example, the impact assessments that they commission from consultants, there's a whole group of, and again, this talks to the work that Glenn and Marco have been doing about how ideas are developed, is that there are these consultancy firms who just mine research opportunities, and they don't actually have any real expertise. They do very poor research and provide the Commission with the evidence that they need, that these kind of changes will increase jobs and do all these kind of things. And sometimes I think we're wasting our breath actually with the Commission. And I think sometimes it's better to go throw in a few bricks and a few other things. There is actually, I mean, as you were talking actually, Marissa, there's a great book by Franzosi on strikes in France. It makes exactly the same argument. It's not whether you win or lose the strike, it's the fact that you go on strike. Is the most important in terms of all these outcomes and things like that. And it is this willingness to engage in a campaign and fight for things that seems to be more important. And the problem is getting different groups to engage in these kind of activities. Mm-hmm. Especially as an academic, you can't really say, well, I think you should all... I always say, well, we're not here to advise you on your industrial campaigns. We're here to help you with the evidence and do these other things. But it is really frustrating when you do all these kind of things and nobody listens. Well, the people in the Commission don't listen.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.